April 23, 1945. Somewhere in western Germany. The village had no name on any map. Just ruins. Smoke drifted from collapsed houses, mixing with the cold morning fog that clung to the broken streets like a shroud. Corporal James Fisher crouched behind a burned-out truck, rifle ready, listening. The war was almost over. Everyone said so, but no one had told the Germans that, and certainly not the boy. He couldn't have been more than 14. Skinny, hollow-eyed, wearing a uniform 3 sizes too large. The sleeves of his Wehrmacht jacket were rolled back to expose bony wrists. His helmet kept sliding down over his forehead, and every few seconds he'd push it up with one trembling hand. In his other hand, he clutched a Panzerfaust, the German anti-tank rocket launcher, far too heavy for someone his size. Fisher's squad had been moving through the village for 20 minutes without contact. Then they'd heard it. Voices, high-pitched, frightened. German voices that cracked with puberty. The Americans took cover and waited. When the enemy finally appeared, Fisher felt his stomach twist. Not men. Boys. A dozen of them, maybe more, emerging from a cellar like ghosts. Most looked 15 at best. Some younger. They wore the ragged remains of Hitler Youth uniforms mixed with oversized army gear. Their boots were worn through. Their faces were streaked with dirt and dried tears. And they were starving. You could see it in their sunken cheeks, their skeletal hands, the way they moved, slow and unsteady, like old men. One boy carried a rifle that looked older than he was. Another had no weapon at all, just a stick grenade tucked into his belt. A third, the smallest, clutched a photograph against his chest, a family portrait, creased and faded. Sergeant Miller raised his hand. Hold fire. The Americans stayed low, watching. The boys hadn't seen them yet. They were talking amongst themselves in rapid, panicked German. One was crying. Another kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. Then the oldest one, maybe 16, stepped forward. He raised his hands slowly, and in broken, accented English, he shouted the words that would change everything. Nicht schießen. Please, do not shoot. We are children. The words hung in the air like a confession. We are children. Sergeant Miller stood slowly, rifle lowered. His face was hard, weathered by 2 years of combat, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe pity. He motioned for his men to lower their weapons. Stay calm, he said quietly. Nobody shoots. Fisher kept his rifle aimed but his finger off the trigger. He watched the boys, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd been taught. The enemy, the Wehrmacht, the soldiers who'd held Europe in a death grip for 5 years. These starving, terrified children? One of the German boys dropped to his knees, hands still raised. He whispered. Please. His voice cracked. We have not eaten. 3 days. No food. Miller stepped forward, speaking slowly. Where are your officers? The oldest boy shook his head. Gone. They left us, told us to defend the village. Then they drove away in the night. Another boy spoke up, his English surprisingly clear. They said the Americans would torture us, kill us, burn us alive. He gestured to the ruins around them. We believed them, but then we heard shooting stop. Heard your voices. You were laughing, laughing. The boy's face twisted in confusion. Soldiers who laugh do not sound like monsters. Miller looked at his squad. Fisher saw the same conflict on every face. Orders said disarm enemy combatants. Take prisoners. But these weren't soldiers. These were kids. Scared, abandoned, starving kids. Private Kowalski, a machinist from Detroit with 2 sons back home, spoke first. Sarge, we got rations. Miller nodded slowly. Yeah, we do. He turned back to the German boys. Drop your weapons. All of them. Now. The boys hesitated. Then, one by one, they obeyed. Rifles clattered to the cobblestones. Grenades were carefully placed on the ground. The Panzerfaust was laid down like a sacred object, too heavy for the boy who'd been carrying it. When they were disarmed, they stood there, shaking, waiting for judgment. Miller pulled a canteen from his belt. He walked forward, slowly, giving them time to see he wasn't a threat. He stopped in front of the oldest boy and held out the canteen. "Water," Miller said. The boy stared at it like it was a trap. "Take it," Miller repeated. "It's just water." The boy reached out with trembling hands. He took the canteen, unscrewed the cap, and drank. Long, desperate gulps. Water spilled down his chin. When he finished, he lowered the canteen and stared at Miller with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Danky," he whispered. Then he started to cry. The other boys watched. One by one, the Americans came forward. Kowalski handed out chocolate bars from his pack. Fisher gave up his spare rations. Another soldier offered bread. Hard, stale military bread, but food nonetheless. The German boys ate like wolves. "No hesitación. Nos cham." Just hunger finally, mercifully being answered. And that's when Fisher saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Across the village square, hidden in the shadow of a collapsed church, were more Germans. But these weren't children. These were prisoners. Adult soldiers. Wehrmacht regulars who'd surrendered 2 hours earlier after a brief firefight. 23 men, disarmed, sitting with their hands behind their heads, guarded by 3 American infantrymen. The German boys saw them, saw their own countrymen defeated, waiting, and then they saw something else, something impossible. The American guards were distributing rations to the prisoners. Not scraps, not leftovers, full K-ration packs, crackers, cheese, canned meat, chocolate bars, coffee. The same food the American soldiers ate. One of the guards, a corporal from Tennessee, was even joking with a German prisoner, pantomiming something with his hands, both men laughing despite the language barrier. The youngest German boy, the one clutching the photograph, whispered something in German. Fisher didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Disbelief, wonder. The oldest boy turned to Sergeant Miller. "You feed them? The enemy?" Miller followed his gaze.
Yeah. Geneva Convention.
"Prisoners get the same rations we do." The boy shook his head slowly. "Our officers told us Americans starve their prisoners, torture them, make them dig graves before shooting them." Miller's expression hardened. "Your officers lied to you, kid, about a lot of things." Another German boy spoke up, his voice small and broken. "We were told if we surrendered, you would burn us. Like you burned Hamburg. Like you burned Dresden." Kowalski stepped forward. "Kid, we're not burning anybody. We're trying to end this damn war so we can go home. You understand? Home. To our families. Just like you want to go home to yours." The boy looked down at the photograph in his hands. "I have no home. It was bombed. My mother, my sister, both gone." The square fell silent. The only sound was the wind moving through the ruins and the distant rumble of artillery, still fighting somewhere to the east. Then Private Kowalski did something that would become part of the story these boys would tell for the rest of their lives. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a battered wallet. From it, he took a photograph of his own. 2 boys, maybe 8 and 10 years old, standing in front of a house, smiling at the camera. "My sons," Kowalski said quietly, "Anthony and Michael." He handed the photo to the German boy. The boy stared at it, then looked up at Kowalski with tears streaming down his face. "They look like my brothers," he whispered. "Yeah," Kowalski said, his voice thick. "Probably do. That's the thing, kid. We're all just trying to protect our families. Difference is, your leaders started a war. We're just trying to finish it." The boy handed back the photograph carefully, like it was made of glass. Kowalski took it, then did something that made Fisher's throat tighten. He pulled another chocolate bar from his pack and pressed it into the boy's hand. "For your brothers, if you find them." The boy nodded, unable to speak. And then, in that ruined village, surrounded by death and destruction, something shifted. The oldest German boy walked toward the prisoners. Slowly, hesitantly, the American guards tensed but didn't stop him. He approached one of the Wehrmacht soldiers, a man maybe 30 years old with a bandage around his head. The boy spoke in rapid German. The soldier responded quietly. Fisher didn't understand the words, but he understood the exchange. The boy was asking questions. The soldier was answering. After a moment, the boy turned back to Miller. He says you gave him milk for his wound, to clean it before bandaging. Miller nodded. Yeah. Medic did that. Standard procedure. The boy's face crumpled. We have no medics. No medicine. No bandages. Men die from small wounds because we have nothing to treat them. He gestured to his ragged companions. We were sent to fight with broken rifles and 5 bullets each. Told to die for the fatherland. But the officers, they had food. They had vehicles. They ran. Another boy, maybe 13, stepped forward. His voice was angry now. They told us we were soldiers. Heroes. But we are not soldiers. We are children sent to die so old men can escape. He pointed at the American troops. You are the enemy. But you feed us. You give water. You show mercy. Why? Sergeant Miller took a long breath. Because, kid, we're not fighting children. We're fighting a regime. A system. And when this war ends, Germany's going to need people to rebuild. Can't do that if we kill all the kids. The boy stared at him. You think we can rebuild? After all this? Miller looked around at the devastation. The shattered buildings. The burned-out tanks. The bodies still waiting to be buried. I've seen worse, Miller said. I was at Normandy. At the Bulge. Saw towns that were nothing but rubble. And you know what? People rebuilt. Always do. Because that's what people do. They survive. They rebuild. They move forward. He locked eyes with the boy. But only if they're alive to do it. That's why we're feeding you. Because this war is almost over, and somebody's got to be left standing to pick up the pieces. One of the younger German boys spoke up. What will happen to us now? Miller thought for a moment. We'll take you to a collection point. Process you as prisoners of war. You'll get food, medical care, and a place to sleep. Then, when this is done, you'll go home. Assuming you have a home to go to. The boy who'd lost his family shook his head. I have no home. No family. Nothing. Kowalski put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Then you start over, kid. That's all any of us can do. Start over. Build something new. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. A convoy of American trucks rolled into the village square. An officer climbed out, a captain, looking tired and irritated. He surveyed the scene, the surrendered children, the adult prisoners, the Americans sharing rations. He walked over to Miller. Sergeant, what the hell is going on here? Miller straightened. Found these boys abandoned by their officers, sir. They surrendered. We're processing them. The captain looked at the children, his expression unreadable. How old are they? Youngest is maybe 12, Miller said. Oldest might be 16. The captain was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. Jesus Christ, the captain muttered. 12 years old. He looked at Miller. You did the right thing, Sergeant. Get them fed, get them medical attention, and load them on the trucks. They're going to the processing center at Marburg. The German boys were herded toward the trucks alongside the adult prisoners. But something happened that Fischer would remember forever. The adult Wehrmacht soldiers, the men who'd fought and killed Americans just hours earlier, stepped aside. They made room for the children to sit first. Gave them the better spots in the trucks, away from the wind. One soldier even took off his own coat and wrapped it around the smallest boy, the one with no family. The boy looked up at the soldier, confused. The soldier said something in German, his voice gentle. Then he smiled, sadly, and ruffled the boy's hair. The oldest German boy climbed into the truck last. Before he did, he turned to Sergeant Miller. Why? He asked one more time. Why show kindness to your enemy? Miller thought about it. Then he said, You're not my enemy, kid. You never were. My enemy was the people who put a rifle in your hands and told you to die for their mistakes. The boy nodded slowly. If we had one, he said quietly, we would not have treated you this way. Miller's expression darkened. I know. That's the difference between us and them. The trucks rolled out 20 minutes later, carrying the surrendered Germans toward prisoner-of-war camps deeper in Allied territory. Fischer watched them go, feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Maybe the war really was ending. Maybe humanity hadn't been completely lost. But the story didn't end there. Because 3 days later, Fisher's unit moved further east and encountered something that would shatter every illusion about mercy and kindness. They found a camp. Not a military installation. Not a prison. A death camp. The gates were open. The guards had fled. Inside were thousands of people. Living skeletons. Men, women, children. Jews. Political prisoners. Roma. Anyone the Nazis had deemed undesirable. They were starving. Dying. Some were already dead. Their bodies stacked like cordwood. The smell was indescribable. The sight was worse. Fisher saw children younger than the German boys he'd given chocolate to. But these children weren't holding rifles. They were holding corpses, the bodies of their parents, too weak to let go. The Americans tried to help. Medics were called. Supplies were rushed in. But many of the prisoners were too far gone. Feeding them too quickly killed them. Their bodies couldn't handle food after months or years of starvation. Men and women ate their first real meal in months and died hours later, their systems unable to process nourishment. Fisher stood in that camp, surrounded by death and suffering, and thought about the German boys, the ones who'd surrendered, the ones who'd claimed they didn't know. And he wondered, how could you not know? How could you live in a country where this was happening and not know? The answer came a week later in the most unexpected way. Fisher's unit was tasked with guarding a temporary POW processing center near Frankfurt. Thousands of German prisoners cycled through daily. Soldiers, civilians, Hitler Youth members. Among them were the boys from the village. Fisher recognized the oldest one immediately. The boy was cleaner now, his wounds bandaged, his hollow cheeks slightly less sunken. He'd gained maybe 5 pounds from regular meals. When he saw Fisher, he approached the fence. "Corporal," he called out. "Fisher, you remember me?" Fisher walked over. "Yeah, I remember. How are you?" The boy shrugged. "Alive. Because of you. Thank you." Fisher nodded. Then, because he had to know, he asked the question that had been haunting him. "The camps. The death camps. Did you know?" The boy's face went pale. "What camps?" Fisher described what he'd seen. The bodies. The ovens. The systematic murder of millions. The boy listened, his expression shifting from confusion to horror to denial. "No," he whispered. "That is not possible. That is American propaganda. We were told the camps were work camps, labor camps. People were relocated for their own safety during the war." Fisher's anger flared. "I saw it with my own eyes, kid. Bodies. Thousands of them. Children younger than you starved to death." The boy shook his head violently. "No, the Führer would never allow such things. We were protecting Germany. Protecting our people from the enemies who wanted to destroy us." Fisher wanted to scream, wanted to grab the boy and shake him. But he saw something in the boy's eyes that stopped him. Not malice, not evil, just confusion, disbelief. The desperate need to believe that everything he'd suffered for had meaning. That his country hadn't been led by monsters. That his sacrifices weren't in vain. "You're going to see it," Fisher said quietly. "They're making all German civilians tour the camps. Making them see what was done in their name. You'll see it too. And then you'll know I'm telling the truth." The boy stepped back from the fence. "I do not believe you. Cannot believe you." Fisher watched him walk away, and he understood something fundamental. These boys were victims too. Not the same as the people murdered in the camps. Nothing could compare to that horror. But victims nonetheless. Victims of propaganda, of indoctrination, of a system that had weaponized their innocence and sent them to die for lies. 2 weeks later, Fisher's unit was tasked with escorting a group of German prisoners to tour the Buchenwald concentration camp. The boys from the village were among them. They were lined up with hundreds of others, soldiers and civilians alike, and marched through the gates. Fisher watched from a distance as they entered. He saw their faces change, saw disbelief turn to shock, shock turn to horror, horror turn to something that looked like the death of faith itself. The oldest boy fell to his knees in the middle of the camp and vomited. Then he wept, great, heaving sobs that shook his entire body. The other boys stood frozen, staring at the evidence of atrocities so vast, so incomprehensible that their minds couldn't process it. When they emerged from Buchenwald 3 hours later, the boys were different. Something fundamental had broken inside them. The oldest boy found Fisher standing near the transport trucks. His face was ashen, eyes red and swollen. He walked up without speaking and stood there, trembling. Fisher didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Finally, the boy spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "You were right. We did this. My country did this." Fisher shook his head. "Not you, kid. You didn't do this. You were lied to, used. But the system, yeah, your system did this." The boy looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I wore the uniform. I carried the gun. I believed the words. That makes me responsible." Fisher thought about that. Maybe. But you were 14 years old. What choice did you have? The boy's laugh was bitter, broken. "Everyone has a choice. I chose to believe, chose not to question, chose to think that our enemies deserved whatever happened to them." He looked up at Fisher. "Now I know what we became, and I will carry that for the rest of my life." Another boy, the one who'd lost his family, approached. His face was blank, emotionless, like someone who'd reached the limit of what a human mind could process. He spoke in English, slowly and carefully. "The Americans in the camp. The soldiers we saw being fed chocolate and milk. They were Jews? Some of them," Fisher said. "Yeah. Political prisoners. Resistance fighters. People who opposed the regime." The boy nodded mechanically. "We were told Jews were subhuman. That they wanted to destroy Germany. That we were protecting ourselves." He paused. "But they looked like us. They were people. Just people." Fisher felt something tighten in his chest. "Yeah, kid. They were just people." The boy continued, his voice distant. "My father was a teacher. Before the war. He taught history. He used to say that propaganda works because people want simple answers. Good versus evil. Us versus them. If you can make people believe the enemy is not human, you can make them do anything." Fisher studied the boy's face. "Your father sounds like a smart man." The boy's expression finally cracked. "He was arrested in 1942 for teaching banned books. I never saw him again." He gestured back toward the camp. "Maybe he died in there. Maybe I walked past his grave today and did not even know." There was no response to that. Fisher stood with these broken children, these child soldiers whose entire worldview had collapsed in a single afternoon, and felt the weight of what war really cost. Not just lives, not just cities, but souls, belief, the ability to trust anything or anyone ever again. Sergeant Miller appeared, clipboard in hand. He saw the boys and his expression softened. "How are they holding up?" Fisher glanced at them. "About as well as you'd expect." Miller nodded grimly. "The brass wants to send them to re-education camps. Teach them democracy, American values." Fisher almost laughed. "You think a few weeks of lectures is going to fix what they saw today?" Miller shrugged. "Got a better idea?" Fisher looked at the oldest boy, who was sitting on the ground now, staring at nothing. "Time," Fisher said. "Give them time. Let them process what they saw. Then maybe they can start to rebuild. But it's going to take years. Maybe their whole lives." Miller made a note on his clipboard. "The re-education camps are mandatory. Orders from SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Every German under 18 who served in the military gets processed through the program." Fisher nodded. "Then I hope whoever designed that program knows what they're doing. Because these kids are going to need more than lectures. They're going to need something to believe in again. And I don't know where you find that after your entire world turns out to be a lie." The boys were loaded onto trucks and transported to a facility near Wiesbaden. It was called a re-education camp, but it looked more like a school. Barracks, classrooms, a mess hall, a small library. No barbed wire. No guard towers. Just American soldiers serving as instructors and supervisors. The program was run by a woman named Eleanor Hartmann, a German-American psychologist from New York who'd volunteered to work with displaced youth. She spoke fluent German and understood both cultures. When the boys from the village arrived, she interviewed each one individually. The oldest boy sat across from her in a small office, hands folded in his lap. She asked him questions. His name, his age, his hometown, his family. Then she asked the harder questions. What were you taught about Jews? About America? About the purpose of the war? The boy answered honestly. We were taught that Jews controlled the banks, the governments, the media, that they were parasites destroying Germany from within, that America was a nation of weak, decadent cowards who would collapse at the first real fight, that our destiny was to rule Europe and create a pure Aryan society. Hartmann wrote notes, her expression neutral. And now? What do you believe now? The boy looked at his hands. I do not know what I believe. Everything I was taught was a lie. But if everything was a lie, then what is true? How do I know you are not lying to me now? Hartmann set down her pen. That's a fair question. And the answer is you don't. You can't know for certain. That's the hard part about propaganda. Once you've been lied to systematically, trust becomes almost impossible. The boy looked up. Then how do I move forward? Hartmann leaned back in her chair. You start by questioning everything. Not just what you were taught before, but what you're being taught now. You demand evidence. You think critically. You compare sources. And slowly, over time, you rebuild your ability to discern truth from lies. The boy was silent for a long moment. That sounds exhausting. Hartmann smiled sadly. It is, but it's the only way to be free. Real freedom isn't just physical. It's mental. It's the ability to think for yourself, to question authority, to demand accountability. That's what democracy is built on. Not blind obedience. Critical thinking. The boy considered this. In Germany, questioning authority was punished. Hartmann nodded. I know. That's why your country ended up where it did. Over the following weeks, the boys attended classes. History, civics, language, philosophy. But the most important lessons didn't happen in classrooms. They happened in the mess hall. At the re-education facility, the boys ate alongside American soldiers. The same food, the same portions, every day. No separation, no hierarchy, just people eating together. At first, the German boys sat by themselves, isolated and silent. But gradually, conversations started. An American soldier from Chicago would ask about life in Germany before the war. A boy would describe his hometown, his school, his family's bakery. Small talk, human talk, nothing political, just the ordinary sharing of lives lived in different places. One afternoon, Private Kowalski visited the facility. He was being rotated back to the States, but before he left, he wanted to check on the boys. He found the youngest one, the boy with no family, sitting alone in the courtyard. The boy recognized him immediately. You are the man with the photograph. The sons. Kowalski sat down beside him. Yeah, that's me. How are you doing, kid? The boy shrugged. They teach us about democracy, about freedom, about human rights. It is strange to learn that people have value just because they exist. Not because of their blood or their nation. Just because they are human. Kowalski nodded. Yeah. Took us a while to figure that out too. America had slavery for a long time. Still got a lot of problems with how we treat black folks. We're not perfect, but at least we try to get better. The boy looked at him. Do you think Germany can get better? Kowalski thought about it. Honestly, I don't know, but I think you can. You're young. You've seen the worst of what hate can do. If you choose differently, if you build something better, then yeah, Germany can get better. The boy pulled something from his pocket. The photograph Kowalski had shown him weeks ago. Wait, how did you get that? Kowalski asked, confused. The boy shook his head. Not yours. Mine. He held it out. It was the family portrait the boy had been clutching in the village. Mother, father, two younger brothers. All smiling. This was taken in 1939, the boy said. Before the war. Before everything changed. My father was a carpenter. My mother sang in the church choir. My brothers played football in the street. We were normal. Happy. Kowalski studied the photo. What happened to them? The boy's voice was flat. Mother died in 1943. Bombing raid. My father was conscripted in 1944, killed on the Eastern Front. My brothers were sent to defend Berlin. I do not know if they are alive. The barracks were empty when I was evacuated. Kowalski handed back the photo. I'm sorry, kid. The boy looked at the image. Sometimes I forget what they looked like. Then I take out this picture and I remember. But it feels like remembering someone else's family. Like I am looking at strangers. Kowalski put a hand on the boy's shoulder. You're still here. That means something. The boy shook his head. I am here because American soldiers gave me chocolate instead of bullets. That is luck. Not meaning. Kowalski squeezed his shoulder. No, kid. You're here because you surrendered. You made a choice. You could have fought. Could have died like they told you to. But you chose to live. That takes courage. The boy looked up. It did not feel like courage. Felt like cowardice. Kowalski shook his head. Kid, I've been fighting for 3 years. I've seen brave men and cowards. And let me tell you, surrendering when you know you've lost isn't cowardice. It's intelligence. Dying for nothing isn't brave. Stupid. The boy absorbed this. After a long silence, he spoke again. What will happen when I leave here? Where will I go? Kowalski didn't have an answer. That's being worked out. A lot of German cities are destroyed. There are refugee camps, displaced persons. The Allies are trying to sort it out, but it's complicated. The boy nodded. I have no skills, no education, no family, no home. I am nothing. Hey, Kowalski said firmly. You're not nothing. You're 15 years old. You've got your whole life ahead of you. You can learn a trade, build a new home, maybe find what's left of your family. But first, you gotta believe you deserve a future. The boy met his eyes. Doi. Deserve a future? After what my country did. Kowalski thought carefully before answering. Yeah. You do. Because you're not your country. You're a kid who got handed a rifle and told lies. You didn't design the camps. You didn't start the war. And now that you know the truth, you get to decide who you become. The boy looked at the photograph again. I want to be someone my mother would be proud of. Then be that person, Kowalski said. That's all any of us can do. 3 months later, in July 1945, the war in Europe had been over for 2 months. The re-education program continued, but boys were gradually being released, sent to whatever homes or relatives could be found. The oldest boy from the village was among the last to leave. He'd spent the time learning English, reading history books, and working in the facility's carpentry shop. On his final day, Eleanor Hartmann called him into her office. You're being released tomorrow, she said. There's a church in Munich that's taking in displaced youth. They'll give you food, shelter, and help you find work. The boy nodded. Thank you. For everything. Hartmann studied him. What will you do? When you leave here? The boy thought about it. I will rebuild. My country is destroyed. My people are broken. But someone has to rebuild. It might as well be me. Hartmann smiled. That's the best answer you could have given. She handed him a small book. It was a journal, bound in leather, blank pages waiting to be filled. What is this? Hartmann leaned forward. Your story. Write it down. Everything that happened. Everything you saw. Everything you learned. Because someday people will need to remember. And if you don't tell them, who will? The boy took the journal, running his fingers over the cover. Why would anyone want to read my story? Hartmann's expression was serious. Because history isn't just written by the victors. It's written by the witnesses. And you are a witness. You saw both sides. The propaganda you believed and the truth you discovered. That makes your testimony valuable. Write it down. Not for me. For the people who come after. So they understand how easy it is to be deceived. How important it is to question everything. The boy held the journal against his chest. I will try. Hartmann nodded. That's all I ask. The next morning, the boy was processed out. He was given civilian clothes, a small amount of money, and travel papers. He boarded a truck heading south toward Munich with 6 other former Hitler Youth members, all around his age, all carrying similar wounds, visible and invisible. They didn't speak much. What was there to say? As the truck rolled through the ruins of Germany, The boy looked out at the devastation. Cities reduced to rubble. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Factories bombed into skeletal remains. This was the 1,000-year Reich. This was the glorious future they'd been promised. Ash and ruin. Hours later, the truck arrived in Munich. The city was a graveyard of buildings. But people moved through the streets, clearing debris, salvaging bricks, rebuilding. Life stubbornly continued. The church was on the eastern edge of the city, one of the few structures still standing. Its steeple had been damaged by bombing, but the main building was intact. A priest, Father Matthias, greeted the arriving boys. He was an old man, maybe 70, with kind eyes and weathered hands. "Welcome," he said in German. "You are safe here. There is food, beds, and work. We do not judge. We do not ask about the past. We only care about who you choose to become." The boys were shown to a dormitory. Simple cots, thin blankets, but clean and dry. Better than the barracks. Better than the trenches. Better than the cold. Terrified nights hiding in cellars waiting for the war to end. The oldest boy set down his bag and sat on the cot. He pulled out the journal Eleanor Hartmann had given him. Opened it to the first blank page. Stared at it. Then he picked up a pencil and wrote the first line of what would become a document that, decades later, would be archived in a German historical museum. "My name is Klaus Zimmermann. I was 14 years old when I became a soldier. I am 15 now. This is what I saw." He wrote for 3 hours. About the village. About the surrender. About the chocolate and water. About watching American soldiers feed enemy prisoners. About the disbelief and confusion. About the death camp. About the collapse of everything he'd believed. When he finished, his hand ached. But something inside him felt lighter, like setting down a burden he'd carried too long. Over the following months, Klaus worked in the church's rebuilding efforts. He hauled bricks, mixed mortar, helped repair roofs. Physical work that exhausted his body and quieted his mind. In the evenings, he wrote. Every night, more pages in the journal. Sometimes Father Matthias would sit with him in the evenings. The old priest never asked what Klaus was writing, but his presence was comforting. One night, Klaus looked up from his journal. "Father, may I ask you something?" "Of course, my son." Klaus chose his words carefully. "Why did you open this church to us? To former Hitler youth? We wore the uniform. We believed the lies. Some of us did terrible things. Why show us mercy?" Father Matthias was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Because I believe in redemption. I believe that people can change. But more than that, I believe that if we condemn an entire generation of children for the sins committed in their name, we guarantee that those sins will be repeated." Klaus frowned. "I do not understand." The priest leaned forward. "Hate breeds hate. Violence breeds violence. If we treat you as monsters, you will become monsters. But if we treat you as human beings capable of growth, capable of learning, capable of choosing a better path, then perhaps you will become that instead." Klaus looked at his journal. "But what if we do not deserve that chance?" Father Matthias shook his head gently. "My son, grace is not about deserving. It is about what we choose to do with the chance we are given. You were given a chance when those American soldiers fed you instead of shooting you. Now you have a choice. Waste that chance by drowning in guilt, or honor it by becoming someone who builds instead of destroys." Klaus thought about Corporal Fischer, about Private Kowalski, about Eleanor Hartmann, about all the people who could have treated him as an enemy but chose compassion instead. "I want to honor it," Klaus said quietly. "Then do so," the priest replied. "One day at a time. One choice at a time." By December 1945, Klaus had filled the entire journal. He started a second one. This time, he wrote not just about the past, but about the present. About the rebuilding efforts. About the people he met. About survivors returning to the city, searching for lost family members. About displaced persons from concentration camps, trying to rebuild lives from nothing. One afternoon, Klaus was working on a roof repair when he saw a figure in the street below. A man, skeletal thin, wearing ill-fitting clothes. The man was stopping people, asking questions, showing them a photograph. Klaus climbed down the ladder and approached. "Excuse me," Klaus said in German. "Are you looking for someone?" The man turned. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow. "Yes, my family. We were separated in 1943. I was sent to Dachau. I survived liberation. Now I am trying to find them." He held out the photograph. A woman and 2 children. Klaus looked at it and felt his stomach drop. "I am sorry. I have not seen them, but the church keeps records of survivors. Father Matthias might be able to help." The man's eyes filled with desperate hope. "Thank you. Thank you." Klaus led him to the church. Father Matthias took the photograph, compared it to his lists of registered survivors. Then his face fell. "I am sorry. Your wife is listed as deceased. Ravensbrück, 1944. The children were transported to Auschwitz in early 1945. There is no record of their survival." The man collapsed. Not a gradual fall, but a complete structural failure, as if every bone in his body gave up simultaneously. He hit the floor and made a sound that Klaus would never forget. Not a scream, not a cry, something worse. The sound of a human soul breaking. Father Matthias knelt beside him, offering what comfort he could. But there was no comfort for this. No words that could fill the void left by a murdered family. Klaus stood frozen, watching. He thought about his own family. His mother killed in a bombing raid. His father, dead on the Eastern Front. His brothers missing, presumed dead in Berlin. And he thought about the system that had caused all of this. The ideology he'd believed in. The propaganda he'd swallowed without question. He walked outside and vomited in the street. Then he sat on the church steps and wept. Not for himself. For everyone. For the millions of dead. For the survivors who would spend the rest of their lives haunted by what they'd lost. For the children who would never be born because their parents had been murdered. For the future that had been stolen from an entire generation. That night, Klaus wrote a new entry in his journal. "Today I met a man who lost everything. His family was murdered in camps that were built by my government. Camps that I did not know existed, but should have known. Could have known, if I had been brave enough to question. I am 15 years old. I did not build the camps. I did not give the orders. But I wore the uniform. I believed the lies. And now I must live with the knowledge that I was part of a machine that destroyed millions of lives. I cannot undo what was done. I cannot bring back the dead. But I can choose what I do with the rest of my life. I can choose to remember, to witness, to ensure that no one ever forgets what happened when people stopped thinking and started obeying. This is my responsibility, not because I am guilty of murder, but because I am guilty of silence, of acceptance, of believing that I was too young or too powerless to question authority. I was wrong. Everyone has the power to question. Everyone has the responsibility to think. And if I do not use that power now, then the people who died in those camps died for nothing." In January 1946, Klaus received news that changed everything. One of his brothers was alive, found in a hospital in Berlin, recovering from injuries sustained during the final days of the war. The brother was 17, scarred and traumatized, but alive. Klaus traveled north to bring him back to Munich. The reunion was quiet. No celebration. No joy. Just 2 broken boys holding each other and crying for everything they'd lost. "What happened to you?" Klaus asked. His brother's voice was flat. "I saw things no one should see. Did things no one should do. I do not want to talk about it." Klaus understood. Some wounds were too deep for words. They returned to Munich together. The church gave his brother a bed next to Klaus's. For weeks, his brother barely spoke. He worked during the day, silent and mechanical, then lay awake at night staring at the ceiling. One evening, Klaus handed him the second journal. "What is this?" his brother asked. "My story," Klaus said. "Our story. Everything that happened. I have been writing it down." His brother opened the journal, read a few pages, then closed it. "Why? Why write this?" "So people remember," Klaus said. "So this never happens again." His brother's laugh was bitter. "It will happen again. People do not learn. They forget. They convince themselves that their situation is different, that their enemies are truly evil, that the ends justify the means. And then history repeats. Klaus shook his head. Not if we bear witness. Not if we refuse to let them forget. His brother stared at him for a long moment. You still have hope. How? Klaus thought about Corporal Fisher. About the chocolate and the water. About the American soldiers who could have killed him but chose mercy instead. Because someone showed me that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose compassion over cruelty. And if they can choose it, so can we. His brother was silent. Then he said, I want to read what you wrote. Klaus handed him the first journal. His brother read through the night. When dawn came, he looked up, eyes red. This is important. More people need to read this. Klaus nodded. Someday, when I am ready to share it. In 1947, Klaus and his brother moved to West Berlin. The city was divided now, occupied by 4 powers, slowly beginning the long process of reconstruction. Klaus found work as a carpenter's apprentice. His brother became a mechanic. They rented a small apartment, barely more than a room, but it was theirs. Klaus continued writing. By 1950, he had filled 7 journals. Thousands of pages documenting his experiences, his observations, his reflections on how a nation had fallen into madness and what it would take to rebuild. In 1952, a publisher in Hamburg read excerpts and offered to publish the work as a book. Klaus hesitated. It meant exposing his past, admitting to everyone what he had been. A Hitler Youth member, a child soldier, part of the machine. But he remembered Eleanor Hartmann's words. History is written by witnesses. In 1953, the book was published under the title, From Believer to Witness, A Child's Journey Through the Third Reich. It was not a bestseller. It was too raw, too honest, too painful. But it was read by educators, by historians, by other survivors trying to make sense of what had happened. Klaus received letters. Some were hateful, accusing him of trying to absolve himself of guilt. Others were grateful, thanking him for his honesty. One letter stood out. It was from an American soldier, Corporal James Fisher. The letter was postmarked from Iowa. Klaus opened it with trembling hands. Dear Klaus, I read your book. I remember you. The village, the surrender, the chocolate. I remember thinking you were just a scared kid who deserved a chance. I am glad you survived. I am glad you wrote your story. What you did, bearing witness, telling the truth even when it was painful, that takes more courage than anything I did in the war. You asked in your book whether you deserved forgiveness. I cannot answer that. Forgiveness is not mine to give. The people who suffered in the camps, the families who were destroyed, they are the ones who must decide. But I can tell you this. You were a child. You were lied to. And when you learned the truth, you did not run from it. You faced it. You owned it. And you spent the rest of your life trying to make sure it never happens again. That matters. Keep writing. Keep witnessing. The world needs people like you. Corporal James Fisher, U.S. Army, retired. Klaus read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the front of his first journal. In 1961, Klaus was invited to speak at a school in Frankfurt. He was 31 years old now, a father of 2, a respected carpenter, a published author. He stood in front of a classroom of teenagers, the same age he'd been when he'd worn the uniform, and told them his story. He told them about the propaganda, the lies, the camps, the Americans who showed mercy, the long road to understanding and redemption. When he finished, a student raised his hand. Herr Zimmermann, do you think something like this could happen again? Klaus thought about the question. The same question his brother had asked years ago. Yes, Klaus said. Can always happen again. Wherever people stop thinking critically. Wherever they accept simple answers to complex problems. Wherever they dehumanize their enemies and glorify their leaders without question. Can happen anywhere. Anytime. The student looked frightened. Then how do we stop it? Klaus smiled sadly. You stop it by questioning everything. By demanding evidence. By refusing to hate people you have never met. By remembering that everyone, even your enemy, is human. And by never ever forgetting what happens when a society chooses hate over humanity. Another student spoke up. But Herr Zimmermann, you were part of it. How do we know you are not still dangerous? Klaus nodded. That is a fair question. And the answer is you do not know. You must judge me by my actions, not my words. By what I have built, not what I once believed. That is all any of us can do. We cannot change the past. But we can choose what we do with the future. The classroom was silent. Then, slowly, one student began to clap. Then another. Then the entire room. Not because Klaus was a hero, but because he was honest. And in a world still recovering from the greatest atrocity in human history, honesty was the rarest and most valuable thing. Klaus Zimmermann lived to be 78 years old. He died in 2009, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. His journals are preserved in the German Historical Museum in Berlin. And his story, the story of a boy who believed lies, witnessed horrors, received unexpected mercy, and spent his life bearing witness, continues to be told.